This is lecture 25. We are all done with the fundamentals of endocrine function, and now we're going to get into anabolic androgenic steroids. I do have to give a nod of acknowledgement to Peter Harmer. He was a professor at Willamette University when I was there. Nod for his work in this field. So my interest in it and the entire foundation of my reasoning comes from Harmer. Okay, note of dedication aside, here's what we'll be talking about ergogenic aids in general, and then we'll outline the eight most common ethical arguments against the use of anabolic steroids in sport, and then we'll cover one of those eight today about effectiveness. So, first, these are the three questions that we'll start with, beginning with what is an ergogenic aid? These are ergogenic aids are pretty much anything that helps your performance, and they can be divided into these three classes: mechanical, psychological, and physiological. People sometimes slice a couple of additional categories off the meat of physiological aids. Nutritional ergogenic aids is one, and pharmacological aids is the other. Both of those are physiological in how they, exert their actions. So it seems sort of like pedantic to separate them. So we're just going to do these three. For mechanical aids, this could be shoes, better shoes. It could be like a really lightweight racing bike, a pre-bent fiberglass vaulting pole. Those really help records. It could be the clap skate. So any sort of mechanical, any sort of equipment. It could be glasses. For psychological aids, like sports psychologists can help an athlete with performance. Um, in ways that I don't, have a background in, but can appreciate that that's a psychological aid. Or the presence of a crowd. I published on this topic with a former student. Having a crowd watch people do a Wingate corresponded to the cycler maintaining their maximum power output for longer. Or maybe a psychological aid could be muting an audience. It's distracting, something like that. So, like earplugs to cancel out the crowd noise. That would be sort of a mechanical meets psychological aid. But then there's the physiological ergogenic aids, and this is where it gets interesting. This is where certainly where the hormonal interventions are, where steroids reside. So some physiological aids aren't regulated at all. I think vitamins and amino acids, Gatorade and hydration means and creatine and coffee, stuff like that. Other aids, other ergogenic physiological aids are conditionally regulated. So you need a prescription. You can use an inhaler if you have asthma, but not if you're just using it as an aid. And then there are other classes, other ergogenic aids that are considered Schedule 3 controlled substances or Schedule 1 or 2. And what this means is Schedule 3 means possession of them, just merely having it is a crime. And so it's important to be, if we're gonna, start assigning criminality to things, it's important to be factual and reasonable about which drugs belong in this class. And we'll be talking a lot about reason and facts in this lecture and the next one. So a hormone, you know what this is. Maybe it's an amine hormone or a peptide hormone, or protein hormone, whatever. Maybe it's a steroid hormone. The picture of the chemical structure, that's cortisol. It's a corticosteroid, a glucocorticoid made in the adrenal cortex, cortex, cortisol. So hormones, these are just chemical messengers, though. And they're compounds that transmit messages from one place to another. And steroid hormones are chemical messengers that are made from cholesterol. So like hydrocortisone, this is cortisol, that's just what you call it when it's used as medication. It's just cortisol in medication form. And that's a steroid hormone, but it's not anabolic. Aldosterone is also a steroid hormone. That's a mineralocorticoid. But it's not an ergogenic aid unless you're competing in high blood pressure, fluid retention, or something. So just because something is a steroid, that doesn't mean it enhances performance. But steroids is usually short for anabolic androgenic steroids, and those do work as ergogenic aids. So there are lots of them. There are lots of endogenous steroids, but then even lots are of exogenous steroids. So the endogenous steroids are the ones your own body makes inside of you. You're making them right now, completely naturally. But then exogenous steroids are administered through needles and pills, maybe creams and patches and whatever. The sprinter on the right side of the screen, that's Ben Johnson. He was the Usain Bolt of the late 80s, the fastest man on the planet. He was born in Jamaica, but he was a Canadian in the Olympics. And he was in the 1988 games. He was the first person ever, shortly before that, to break 9.9, right? 9.9 seconds in the 100-meter dash. Um, and then when he got to the Olympics, he broke 9.8. So he was also the first person in the world to beat 9.8. And then they took his medal away and like pretended he never ran it because he was on stenozolol, the steroid that has the arrows pointing to him. And then when this happened, when it was discovered that Ben Johnson was on steroids on stenozolol, uh, there was a renowned cardiologist who was doing research on that drug at the time. It's Paul Thompson, chief of cardiology at Hartford Hospital. I actually published an abstract with him a decade ago, but that was a tiny, like nothing project compared to Paul's major works. And some of his major works are on anabolic steroids, and we'll be going over those studies in the next lecture. So keep Paul Thompson and stanozolol in mind. This is just a look at a bunch of different exogenous steroids. This is a fraction of what's out there. The generic name, the trade name, the dosage, and then whether it's taken orally or intramuscularly. There are other ways to take it too, but those are the two common modes. And we'll talk about the differences between injection and oral in the next lecture. It's an important difference. Those differences are very important. So let's move into whether it's ethical to use anabolic androgenic steroids in competitive sports. It's a complicated question, but uh, answering it requires an understanding of how steroids produce their effects and their side effects too. And because discussing ethics without knowing anything about the underlying science is always creepy. So we don't want to do that. All right, we're going to talk about the physiology of anabolic steroids at the same time that we discuss the ethical considerations of their use. Separating the two, again, I just find that so creepy. We need to understand the science and the mechanisms to be able to discuss the ethics. And I have Joe Biden answering the question here for a very specific reason, which I'll address in the next lecture. And obviously, this isn't an exact quotation, but you'll understand why he's saying this in the next lecture so soon. Um, and what I'm pretending he's saying here, steroids aren't natural, they make sports unfair, and they cause health problems. Those are the three most common arguments against steroids that you hear by people who don't know anything about them. But they aren't the only arguments that you'll hear. So let's make a list of the 8 most common anti-steroid arguments. And it's just going to be a list today. We're not going to do the deep dive. And those three reasons are in it. Um, but we'll cover the details of one argument, and then we'll get into the details of the other 7 in the next lecture. Um, and in those details, what I'll say is going to clash with the conventional wisdom in all of them. But today, it's just a list of conventional wisdom. So the first argument against steroids is the athlete's health, right? Steroids have side effects, and for that reason, they should be prohibited. The second argument is the unnecessary risk for harm and social coercion, meaning you're compelled, you're practically forced to take them if you want to compete. The third argument is that steroids make sports unfair. This is the unlevel playing field argument. It's not fair if I'm natural and you're not. I shouldn't have to compete against you. Number four is the spirit of the sport argument. Baseball and basketball and soccer and whatever ball. They have these long cherished legacies, and we're tarnishing those legacies. We're sullying them with drugs. The fifth argument is natural versus unnatural. We should be competing with the resources given to us at birth, or by, God, or through training or whatever, natural means. We shouldn't be doping our way to success. Number six, rules, right? Laws and rules prohibit steroids. So you're breaking those laws and rules by taking it. So you shouldn't be taking it because you're a rule breaker and law breaker. Number seven, harm to others. If you're in a contact sport, especially, you're bigger, you're stronger, you're more aggressive. Other people are being put at risk of harm. And so it's not just your own side effects that you're worried about anymore, it's other people too. You're hitting them harder and whatever. Number eight, steroids don't even do what the athletes think. So why bother risking the side effects if they aren't going to earn you any gold medals? So that's all of the common ethical arguments that people make, and we'll address all of them, just not in this lecture. In this lecture, we're only going to address number eight, and this is the order we're going to go in. We're just going to cover that top one on the roster today. So it may seem like nobody's making this argument that the steroids don't really work, but it does continue to have some support. So this is an article by Gene Wilson. In the last 6.5 years, it has 123 new citations. So it hasn't fallen into total obscurity. So let's go through some of the claims that the author makes. These are quotations from the article. So he's talking about misconceptions. It was assumed that the administration of androgens in supraphysiological amounts to normal men would do even more than the normal amount. Right? That's one of Gene's misconceptions. And then in men with normal levels of plasma androgens, the androgen receptor in most tissues appears either to be saturated or downregulated. So here he's saying that if you inject even more, swallow even more, rub more ointments all creamily on you or whatever, there's nowhere for the testosterone to bind, right? There's nowhere for it to go because the androgen receptors are already saturated. And if it doesn't bind, there's no action. The effects of androgens are purely psychological. The athletes believed that the androgens do enhance strength, and as a consequence, the magic pills began to be used widely, despite the lack of clear evidence that they do, in fact, improve athletic ability. After more than 30 years of use, it is still not clear whether androgens do, in fact, enhance athletic performance. Then he goes on to talk about some studies that have been done that failed to show an effect. These 9 studies failed to demonstrate an increase in muscle strength. Um, and he doesn't talk about the weaknesses in those studies, of which there are plenty, but he does mention potential weaknesses in a couple of the studies that did show a beneficial effect. So there's obviously a lot of bias here. Um, a positive relationship between androgen use and athletic performance is unproven, and that effects on uh, weight and muscle mass are inconsistent. I read that badly, but you can read it yourself. So then Gene Wilson, he also wrote a chapter in a 1996 textbook, The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics, I think it was called. And his chapter was just called Androgens. But so that was from 1996. And he furthers his position that testosterone will only elicit modest effects um, if the people taking it have no gonadal obstacles to overcome, right? If they're not hypogonadal or something. And this isn't where steroids don't do anything, buck stops, right? The buck marches along, it just keeps on going, broadcasting its message. But it's not worth further commentary. You get the argument. So let's counter it. Let's break it down. So first, you need a therapeutic dose. in anything. It doesn't matter what you have. Like if you have a headache and you take a quarter of a Tylenol, you'll still have a headache. That's not going to cure it. The dose needs to be big enough to elicit a response. And the same is true with anabolic steroids. And historically, it's been tough to get an IRB, an institutional review board, to approve a study design that takes healthy athletes, elite or healthy athletes, and injects them with 800 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams of testosterone, and then tracks their bench press or their squat or sprint speed or bicep circumference, whatever, tracks something like that. So most of these studies are either um, giving cachectic people a physiological dose, or they're giving healthy people useless dose, 100 milligrams a week, something like that. Um, some dose that's not going to be, IFBB approved, used in the bodybuilding community. So supraphysiological doses in athletes, that's not really an approved study design by the review boards. But in the 70s and 80s, there's tons of research being done in animal models, not in human athletes, but in mice and rats. And mice and rats got super ripped. And the same physiological pathways exist in humans, in us. So why wouldn't we also respond? Like if mice get all athletic and hulky, why wouldn't people? Um, and in the um, endocrine lectures, in the lectures that I just finished, I mentioned that muscle is multinucleated. So satellite cells, these are the cells that donate their nuclei, their nucleuses, to skeletal muscle cells. In the picture, those brown cells, those are the satellite cells. They live between the sarcolemma and the basement membrane. And then the blue things, those are nuclei. Those are your myonuclei. Not yours, but they're that person's, that drawing's nuclei. And again, in animal models, administration of testosterone increases satellite cell proliferation. And then you see more myonuclei following that. And just remember that muscle cells are huge, and huge cells have huge biological domains. And those domains, they need to be governed. One nucleus, which is doing the governing, isn't enough to govern the entire expanse of a muscle cell. They're huge. So you need multiple nuclei full of their own, full, they're all the same, but full of DNA. Um, so for a huge cell to become even huger, you just need more nuclei in there. Not just, but that's a requisite feature for hypertrophy is let's get more nuclei in there. And androgens increase the number, and thus the possibility of protein accretion, hypertrophy, right, through a larger domain. And then, so translation, that, the creation of proteins, this is a genetic event. You need nuclei to do it. Add more myonuclei, you can govern more geography, and so you can hypertrophy throughout that expanse. And again, androgens do this really well. There's plenty of research. That's what we're looking at on this screen. Plenty of research demonstrating these phenomena, and more studies looking at the breadth of satellite cell importance and other regulatory features. But the summary is that androgens increase myonuclei, and more myonuclei precedes growth, precedes hypertrophy. And we also study androgen therapy in wasting conditions, muscle wasting, to great effect. So often it's patients with HIV, um, who have muscle wasting. That's not, the only cachectic patients, but administering testosterone to these patients is incredibly effective at preserving and increasing muscle mass. Again, late 90s, early 2000s, there were tons of studies about muscle wasting syndromes and androgen interventions, and they're very effective. Taking a different look at this, some people say that hyper-muscled bodies are bad at sports. Like if you're all bulky and inflexible and your power to weight ratio, gets ruined or whatever, good luck swimming, or jumping or whatever. Like you can't even float in the water. If you're on a bike, you're too heavy. These sorts of arguments. And there's a tiny bit of truth here and there. Largely there isn't, but there are hints of truth in claims like that. And um, so this is a study that showed that testosterone resistance training, you're increasing the pennation angle. And when you do these sorts of changes to the architecture of muscle, maybe it is a tiny bit slower in one regard. But speed depends on other regards too, and performance depends on other regards too. So the point is, some sports do benefit less from steroids than other sports do, but a lot of these claims about, being bulky and whatever, that's really kind of overreaching, figuratively overreaching. It's making a bad argument, is what I mean. And then what Gene Wilson, who wrote that article earlier, discrediting steroids, what he said in that article about saturated androgen receptors has a hint of truth as well. Now, it's not true in competitive athletes, but in older adults without a history of resistance training, there is a decline of androgen receptors. The receptor concentration is reduced. And so, taking a 70-year-old and shooting him up with IFBB doses of testosterone isn't going to have the effect that you're hoping for, unless the hopeful outcome is um, acceleration of prostate enlargement. Then it'll probably have that effect. And so that's one side effect. If you're disposing of excess testosterone in the prostate, you're going to convert it to dihydrotestosterone. And that causes benign prostatic hyperplasia, the growth of the prostate. And that really increases the duration of your turn at the urinal, how long it takes you to pee. So being careful with testosterone excesses is important. It's not going to work in the way that you want it to if androgen receptors in the skeletal muscle really are saturated. And in older adults, that tends to happen. But let's look at an example of steroids in sport. In the 1970s, right, the East Germans did a really good job at showing everyone in the world how effective steroids can be in swimming, no less. Like, yo, you won't even float. You'll just be sinking. You'll be terrible. The arguments against swimming. The East Germans disproved those. East Germany was its own country from 1949 to 1990, right? And then it was absorbed into Germany again. The East and West, right? The unification. But in 1972, at the Olympic Games, the East German female, the women, the female swimmers, they won no gold medals. And then obviously they didn't set any records because you have to win a gold to, set a record. Otherwise, somebody else set the record. Then, between 1972 and 1976, in that 4-year period, they did a ton of steroids. And then they came back in 1976 and they won 11 gold medals and they set 8 world records. And there were only 12 individual swimming events. Um, that in those games, and they won 10. They won gold in 10 of them, right? 10 out of 12 individual events, the women won gold. Like dolphins wouldn't have beaten them. I mean, they were so dominant. But then they get interviewed, right? The females, they're interviewed and they sound like super masculine. It's like I sound like a prepubescent princess, right? By comparison to these like deep voiced, like Doberman women, I want to thank God I did it for my homeland. So like that. So like strength lies not in defense, but attack. Whatever. Like these sort of patriotic, like what everybody sort of says, thank God and whatever. Um, oh man, they were like these deep voices. And then what sort of completes the joke here is what, like in 1991, in this New York Times article, it quotes the coach. I mean, literally, it quotes the coach who dismissed the claims about the weirdly masculine voices by saying, "We came here to swim, not sing." That's what the coach said. So that was swimming, right? Super effective in swimming. But like where anabolic steroids have proven to be even more effective, like where have they proven to be most effective? It's probably in bodybuilding. I mean, nobody admits doing it though in any sport, whether it's bodybuilding or football or whatever. People just don't admit doing it unless it's totally anonymous. But in some of these surveys, if they're anonymous, it turns out a ton of people do it. So in summary, androgens, anabolic androgenic steroids. This is a set of chemicals made from cholesterol that exist endogenously. You endogenously produce them, but you can also take them exogenously. And these chemicals produce great effects and side effects. Can they be abused? Yeah, of course. Like anything can be abused. Steroids are definitely abused. Do people who take steroids, do they know what they're doing? Not always, right? Hardly ever, probably. And that's what leads to the debate, should they be banned in sports? And these are the eight most common arguments, ethical arguments against anabolic steroids in sports settings. And we covered number eight today. That's why it's all crossed out. We'll do the first seven in the next lecture. And then we'll also talk about the ninth, which pretty much nobody argues, but it's the one that everyone seems to believe. They just argue the other eight insincerely in the place of that one. So that's up next. That's in lecture 26. And that's all for today. That's all for lecture 25. Here are the review questions. And I will see you for one more lecture on steroids before we move into enzymes.